Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the History Club channel. I'm Mr. McGee. Now, I've been on vacation the last couple weeks. By the way, Lake Michigan is beautiful. But now that I've had my fun in the Great Lakes sun, it is time for us to take a look at the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, why are we taking a look at the collapse of the Soviet Union? Because that is connected with the last leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. In the last episode, we saw that we had Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko, two very old guys who died about a year and a couple months after they took office. Well, Mikhail Gorbachev is now going to be the leader, and he is going to be the last leader of the Soviet Union. So we're going to take a look at what he did as leader and what were the things that caused the Soviet Union to collapse. So ladies and gentlemen, let's begin. Now, when it comes to Mikhail Gorbachev and the collapse of the Soviet Union, we can make an hour-long video on all the factors that are involved in the collapse of the Soviet Union and in Mikhail Gorbachev's leadership. But something tells me you don't want an hour-long video. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down Mikhail Gorbachev and the collapse of the Soviet Union into three main parts and give a brief overview of those parts. Number one, Ronald Reagan. He's the president of the United States from 1980 to 1988. Number two, Glasnost. That is going to be a program that Mikhail Gorbachev puts in place. And number three, Perestroika. Perestroika is going to be another program that Gorbachev puts in place. We're going to take a look at the impact of all three of these factors: Ronald Reagan, Glasnost, and Perestroika. Number one, Ronald Reagan. Now, in order to understand Ronald Reagan's impact, we have to take a look at the Soviet Union in the past. If you remember in previous videos, I talked about the fact that the Soviet Union's economy is not doing well, which kind of makes sense because no economy does well under communism. But with Brezhnev and even Andropov and Chernenko for the short time that they were in office, their entire focus has been the military. Because the economy is doing so bad, the only way to stay on par with the United States is through the military. So the idea around the world at this time is that, wow, the United States and the Soviet Union, they have equal militaries. They're basically going to destroy each other if they ever go to war because it's just balanced. We also said in previous videos that the United States is going through probably one of the worst decades in U.S. history, the 1970s. If you remember, we talked about the fact that you had the U.S. pull out from Vietnam and the North Vietnamese coming in and taking over all of Vietnam. You had the resignation of Richard Nixon and the Watergate scandal. You then had the failed presidency of Jimmy Carter, both in terms of economic policy and foreign policy. So the United States has been down for a decade plus, maybe going into the late 60s. The U.S. has been very, very down, and so that has allowed the Soviet Union to stay on par with the United States militarily, even though their economy is bad because the U.S. economy is also terrible. Well, into that situation steps Ronald Reagan. And Reagan's policies, both economically and militarily, changed the entire playing field. There's an old adage that when you're facing an opponent and your opponent is hard to beat, sometimes what you have to do is change the state of play. In other words, change things up from what has always been done. So, again, brief overview. Reagan is going to put economic policies in place that cause the United States economy to boom. The 70s and the doldrums of the 70s are done away with. The 80s is going to be an economic boom that's going to last into the 90s. So at this point, the United States has cash to burn. Also, Ronald Reagan is going to institute a new foreign policy. Now, since the end of World War II, the policy of the United States and its allies had been containment. Stop the Soviet Union from spreading. We're not going to confront the Soviet Union. We're not even trying to defeat the Soviet Union. We're just trying to stop the spread of their influence. Ronald Reagan comes in, and his idea is, no, we're going to defeat the Soviet Union. That is a completely different mindset, which means that you're going to attack the Soviet Union differently. Now, when I say defeat the Soviet Union, it didn't mean Ronald Reagan was going to go to war with the Soviet Union and start World War III, but he was going to defeat them. Ronald Reagan's vision was, We win, they lose. He talked about how the Soviet Union would be put on the ash heap of history. Those were very strong words, backed up by a huge military budget. Now, if you're asking yourself, okay, well, what does all this have to do with Mikhail Gorbachev? Well, you have to remember, Mikhail Gorbachev becomes the new leader of the Soviet Union on March 11th, 1985. That's in the middle of Ronald Reagan's presidency. So Ronald Reagan has had almost a 5-year head start on Gorbachev. The economy of the United States is booming. As I said before, the U.S. has cash to burn, and the government is throwing all that cash into the military. So if you're Gorbachev, you're thinking, oh no, what are we going to do? You're looking at the United States military, and it is just building new technology. It is building up at a level that you can't catch up to. You look at your economy in the Soviet Union, and the economy of the Soviet Union is in shambles. So you don't have the resources to throw into your military to keep up with the United States. Well, if the Soviet Union can't keep up with the United States, then there's no more parity, there's no more balance, and the fear of the Soviet Union goes away. And all of a sudden, the influence through that fear that people have of the Soviet Union, if that goes away, and their foreign policy collapses, along with the shambles that is their economy, well, now the Soviet Union is going to collapse. So if you're Gorbachev, you're trying to figure out, oh no, how can I do this? There's no way to keep up with the United States at this point. That's why Ronald Reagan is such a factor in the collapse of the Soviet Union. Number 2, Glasnost. Glasnost is the Russian word for openness. Now, again, this is why we take a look at history, we take a look at these multiple factors. If you are Gorbachev, you realize that the United States is ramping up its military, and you cannot keep pace unless you can find a way to basically stabilize your own collapsing economy. So, one of the things that Gorbachev did was Glasnost. In other words, let's have a little bit of political freedom, because remember, he's trying to stabilize the country. So, Glasnost allowed some multi-candidate elections. Well, if you're thinking elections, why is that some sort of huge thing? You have to remember, this is the Soviet Union. Nobody in the Politburo has had to run for election where the citizens of Russia are selecting them. So Gorbachev allows multi-candidate elections. He also gives a little bit more openness for the press. To help you understand what life was like before in the Soviet Union, the major newspaper of the Soviet Union was a paper called Pravda. Pravda is the Russian word for truth. The only problem was it was the biggest joke around the rest of the world because Pravda never printed anything that was true. You knew that if you got a newspaper from Pravda, whatever they were telling you about the Soviet government was going to be a lie because the government controlled the press. By the way, that's why it's important to have a free press, and that's why the founders of the United States put that in the First Amendment, that there would be freedom of the press. The press is very important because the press is supposed to give you information that you can use to make informed decisions. Well, if the government controls the press, as they did in the Soviet Union, then there is no accurate information, and there's no way to get that accurate information. Now, the problem for Gorbachev when it came to Glasnost, by the way, Glasnost was implemented in the late 1980s, the problem is this. Once that toothpaste is out of the tube, you can't put it back in. So once people get a taste of political freedom, once people get a taste of, oh, hey, I can select the leaders that represent me, how do you take that away? And in fact, not only can you not take it back, but now people want more of it. So now there's a push for, hey, don't just go 2 steps, go all the way. So instead of stabilizing the Soviet Union, now there's an even bigger push for more freedoms. No, we want more reforms. The people start electing certain candidates into the Russian government who are pushing for more reforms. So Gorbachev only wants to go halfway to kind of keep things steady. Instead, everyone's like, no, we want more of it. And so things begin to collapse. Not only that, but once other countries that were controlled by the Soviet Union, countries like Estonia and Poland and Hungary, once they see what's going on in the Soviet Union, they begin to demand independence from the Soviet Union. And there begin to be uprisings. I mean, uprisings in a non-violent way. So people weren't destroying the countryside or anything like that. But people begin to rise up and say, no, we want independence. We want control of our own country again. And for the most part, they got it. As you get into the late 1980s, early 1990s, country after country that was controlled by the Soviet Union begin to break away and begin to become independent. And the Soviet Union is now shrinking. By the way, these countries, as they are demanding independence from the Soviet Union, they're being backed by the United States, who is now back to being a military force in the world and now has the cash to be able to help them out. So again, all those factors play a huge part in the collapse of the Soviet Union. Number 3, Perestroika. Perestroika was first implemented in the mid-1980s when Gorbachev first came into office. Remember, we said that the Soviet economy was in shambles, and so Gorbachev is trying to figure out, how do I prop this up? How do I stabilize it? Perestroika allowed limited free enterprise. You as a factory manager were allowed more freedom in your hiring process, more freedom in terms of how you ran your factory and making changes in the factory. But you still weren't allowed to make a profit. There still wasn't private property. And you certainly weren't going to be allowed to just own any company you wanted at any time and just run it how you want it to. All of that was still controlled by the Soviet Union. So Perestroika becomes kind of a half measure. All right, we're going to do a little bit to try to stabilize the economy. In the case of Perestroika, Perestroika is not, how do we get the toothpaste back in the tube? We can't. Perestroika was, hey, you see that shack? That shack just needs to be demolished. There's nothing we can do about it. And then someone comes along and says, no. Hey, I think if we just replace a few of the roofing tiles, that will make the shack okay. Well, no. The shack is leaning. It's almost about to collapse. Even animals don't want to live in the shack. You replacing a few roofing tiles, that's not going to do anything. And so with Perestroika is nice in the fact that, hey, there's a little bit more freedom to work within the factory and make decisions, but you still don't have free markets, free enterprise. One of the mistakes that some people make in analyzing Mikhail Gorbachev is they look at Glasnost, openness, and Perestroika, restructuring, and they go, Gorbachev, he recognized that the Soviet Union was terrible, and he looked to change it. And he's responsible for the collapse of the Soviet Union, and yay for Gorbachev. Well, no, Gorbachev was a communist. Gorbachev had no intention of destroying the Soviet Union. The poor guy just came in the middle of the Soviet Union's collapse and was trying to do things to just hold it in place, keep it going a little bit longer. But Glasnost actually hastened the destruction of the Soviet Union because people wanted more freedom and more reforms, and Perestroika did nothing to bolster the economy of the Soviet Union, so they still weren't able to catch up to where the United States was, and therefore they were not able to put money into their military to try to keep it on par with the United States. Needless to say, the reforms of Glasnost and Perestroika did not exactly sit well with the Politburo, that group of leaders who pretty much controlled all aspects of the Soviet Union. Any reduction in their power base was going to be frowned on heavily. And so Gorbachev and members of the Politburo end up at war with each other, and so this just makes things worse. So you've got people saying, no, there needs to be more reforms in the Soviet Union. We're not just going halfway. You've got the Politburo saying, no, we don't want any reforms at all, and they're beating up on Gorbachev. And you got Gorbachev, who likes communism, who's trying to kind of do this middle road between both groups. Well, ladies and gentlemen, when you stand in the middle of the road, you just get run over. So needless to say, the three factors we talked about, plus the reaction of the Politburo in going against Gorbachev, not to mention you have countries that have been controlled by the Soviet Union breaking away and becoming independent, all of this just eventually leads to a collapse. So on December 25th, 1991, Gorbachev resigns from office. the Soviet hammer and sickle flag is lowered for the last time, and the Soviet Union is no more. With the Soviet Union collapsing and Gorbachev resigning, President Boris Yeltsin will become the leader of Russia. No longer the Soviet Union, but the leader of Russia. He will be the first democratically elected leader of Russia. There may be one more episode after the Boris Yeltsin one on the Soviet Union, but the reason why there's only going to be one more episode, possibly two, is because Boris Yeltsin, when he resigns from office eventually, and we'll get into that, he has many vice presidents. But his last vice president is a former KGB officer named Vladimir Putin. So we'll probably end with Vladimir Putin becoming president. But Boris Yeltsin and Vladimir Putin, that's for the next episode. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Again, by the way, this was a brief overview. We just didn't have time to talk about Ronald Reagan going to the Berlin Wall and saying, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." We didn't get to talk about the coup attempts in detail to remove Gorbachev. There's a whole lot of other factors. We didn't even get to talk about the reformers who were elected, who they were, and what they pushed for in the Soviet Union. There would end up being an hour-long video. There's just no way to put all that content in. But I hope this brief overview gave you a good idea of what led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and hopefully a better understanding of the Soviet Union. So I'll see you, Lord willing, next time. If you have any questions, please leave them respectfully and politely in the description box below. I'm Mr. McGee. Take care.